Hey guys, my name is Toby and welcome back to another exciting Photoshop tutorial where today we're going to be spending some quality time with something near and dear to my heart, which is obviously sharpening. So let's jump straight in. And before I get to talking about the cool sharpening tools that you absolutely do want to use because they're awesome, we're going to talk about the rubbish ones that Photoshop still has for no apparent reason. So the first of which I'm going to discuss quickly is the Sharpen brush tool. Now this tool is it's quite an old one and it's generally not very good, and the reason is that you can't really do anything consistent with it, and it's not a very complicated way of sharpening things. You might think, well, maybe you can come in here and you can just kind of sharpen an area, but the problem is that, are you sharpening this bit as much as this bit? Are you being careful? Because the problem is it's not like a paintbrush where you do one stroke and then as long as you keep the mouse down it will do that. It's a case of you can sit there and sort of scribble over an area and it will very quickly turn into some kind of ridiculous looking QR code type thing. And it's not a good way of doing this. You could argue that, it's a good way of, very quickly sharpening a certain area without sharpening like the rest of an image, but there are better ways of doing that, which I will show you in a minute. So, the blur tool and the smudge tool in this stack, by the way, are both kind of fairly useful, but the sharpen one is one that I almost never use. So, in order to kind of show you the difference between some of the other sharpening techniques, what I'm going to do is I'm going to duplicate our background a few times so we can kind of keep them there and turn them on and off. Now the easiest way to duplicate a background is to press Command or Control if you're on the PC and J, and that's going to give us a duplicated layer. So Photoshop has an interesting policy about adding new features. So if we go up to Filter and then the Sharpen tab, what you're going to see is a whole bunch of different tools. And basically what Photoshop does, and I believe this is their kind of thought process about it, is that whenever they add a new feature, they don't want to take away the old feature in case there are still people out there who like to use it, and they don't want to have to force people to use a tool that they're maybe not as happy with. So they generally just leave things, which is why we have things like Sharpen and Sharpen Edges and Sharpen More. These three here are pretty useless. Let's just quickly look at what they do. So I'm just going to apply Sharpen to our duplicated layer. And if we zoom in here and I turn this on and off, you're going to see it has done a little bit of sharpening. And it's quite subtle, but it is there. Hopefully you can see that on the video. And I'm just going to call this layer Sharpen. So that's that one. Now, Photoshop obviously realized, or Adobe I should say, not Photoshop. Adobe realized that, well, what if people want to sharpen more than that? So they added one called Sharpen More. And I'll give you one guess what this does. It's basically exactly the same thing, except that it sort of sharpens a bit more. So this is what Sharpen looks like. That's Sharpen More. I'll just layer these up right. So we've got nothing, Sharpen, Sharpen More. And this is a little bit more heavy-handed. It's still not a good tool because neither of these give you any kind of control over kind of how much or where the sharpening is applied, which is not so good. So Photoshop realizing that maybe everybody doesn't want to just sharpen everything about their image, added one called Sharpen Edges. Now what this one will do, if I just apply this, is, and I'll give you one guess what this does, it looks for edges and it will kind of sharpen them. So if you notice, it's not sharpening all the detail that's in here, it's just kind of finding these edges here and just sharpening them up a little bit. But again, it's one of these tools that gives you no control over amount or anything like that. So again, it's not a great tool. So that's 3 down and 3 to go. Let's go back to our background layer and just duplicate another one. So we're not going to talk about shake reduction because it's technically not sharpening, it's more like kind of rescuing an image if you like, but we are going to talk about these two down here quickly. So Unsharp Mask until recently was my absolute favourite way of sharpening an image, and it's so good in fact that I added a custom keyboard shortcut for it because I used it that often. So let's quickly have a look at what this does. Now this one does give you a few menu controls. I'm just going to zoom in here so we can see a little bit more clearly what this is doing. what this will do is it gives you, first of all, it gives you a little preview window. If you click and hold in here, it will kind of show you before, and then if you let go, it will show you afterwards. And you have 3 controls. It also gives you a full screen preview, which is quite nice as well, so you can kind of see in like glorious detail what it's actually doing. So the 3 controls you have are amount, radius, and threshold, and amount is kind of fairly self-explanatory. This is just like the strength of your effect, I suppose. So, you know, you could have a little bit or go really mad with it. So that's kind of what that one does. Let's just leave this all the way up for a second, because I'm going to now try and explain what radius does. So if you imagine that it's sharpening each pixel individually, it treats each pixel as an individual kind of thing to sharpen. Radius is how far out it should expand from that pixel to affect nearby pixels. And bearing in mind, this is kind of happening to every pixel. And where it's got an edge, it will kind of start to have this kind of glowy effect. So if we bring this radius up, that's going to get bigger and bigger and bigger. So wherever it's sharpening, it's a radius of, from the point it's sharpening, how far out from that point should it sharpen. And generally you want to leave this quite low, to be fair. I mean, I would never put the amount up this. I'm just doing this to kind of show you what it looks like. About 150 is probably not too bad. And maybe about that. So if I just toggle this on and off, you can see kind of already what a big difference that's making to the clarity of this. Now, where this tool I think becomes really powerful is with threshold. Now, what threshold would let you do is effectively it's kind of like edge detection is the best way I can describe it. So if you have this all the way down at 0, let's just turn this up quite a lot so we can kind of see what we're doing. If you have this all the way down at 0, all of the little detail and any bit of noise or anything like that that's in there is going to get sharpened. As soon as you turn this up to about that much, and 8 or 9 is probably about where I'd leave this, because what that will do is it will avoid sharpening noise, which is kind of where a lot of the other tools will fall short. So you can actually kind of limit the amount of detail that it will sharpen. So, you know, you can bring it quite high up, so that only like the most contrasty bits will actually be sharpened. And, you know, it's a nice way of controlling the sharpening in your image. Now, like I say, generally speaking, my default, if you like, is probably around like 7 or 8, something like that. And then it's a case of controlling the radius and the amount to get a sort of pleasing effect. I do know that some of the ones we've been mucking around with look a little bit garish, but I'm just doing that to kind of show you, you know, where it's actually taking effect. But, you know, generally between like 1 and 3 is probably good for most images on the radius. But again, kind of it's up to your discretion. This will vary depending on how big your picture is. If you're dealing with quite a small picture, you're going to want to use a smaller radius, I tend to find. Whereas if you're dealing with like a 50 megapixel Hasselblad picture, you might want to put it up to like 6 or 7, because you're going to have the radius, the space to do it. But yeah, probably around there is pretty good. And then I normally put the percentage of the amount somewhere. It's got normally over 100, somewhere between 100 and 200, depending on the image and how much I actually want to sharpen it. So, you know, that is sharpening that up quite considerably, but it's not getting a lot of the grain and stuff in there. We maybe just want to sharpen up the text. So, you know, you can see that that is making a pretty stark difference to our image. And we'll just name this Unsharp Mask. It's also one of the strangest named tools in Photoshop. I think a lot of people overlook this because it says, well, it's unsharp, isn't it? It's like, well, yeah, but it's also probably the best sharpening tool that I know of in Photoshop. Now, the other one in the filters menu that we're going to look at is called Smart Sharpen. Now, Smart Sharpen is kind of similar to Unsharp Mask, except that it's got a couple of different options. So if you don't have this area open, this little twiddly menu there that you can get to, again, that has amount and radius, which work kind of in the same way. You know, you can do some really garish looking things with it if you want. You can also reduce the noise in your image. And this is kind of the same thing as threshold. It's not actually doing like noise reduction. It's just limiting the noise that gets sharpened. So it's kind of trying to intelligently look for the noise in your image and very small bits of detail and avoiding sharpening that. So, you know, you've got a number of tools. So let's just turn this up again so I can kind of show you for effect what we're doing. Now, this is where this tool becomes interesting. You can actually control the sharpening to either just the shadows or just the highlights, or you can kind of limit the point in the middle where the shadow and highlight sharpening meets. So, if we turn the fade amount up, you're going to start to notice in the shadows, if you look at the lettering here, that the kind of more you turn this up, the less it actually gets sharpened, which is quite cool. The tonal width is an interesting one. So you can either look at just the really, really dark shadows, or you can kind of do like most of the image. You know, this is like the percentage of the image from the shadows up that it's affecting. In reverse of that, you've got the percentage of the image from the highlights down that's affected. So if you've got this, it's going to go from kind of white to 77% grey, if you like. Sorry, from white to 70% of the image down towards black, if that makes sense. And you can kind of control, you know, so in this case, we know that maybe we don't want to highlight kind of or sharpen all of this bit in here. So we could turn the fade amount up, and we want it to not affect most of the image, and we only want it to affect kind of the shadows. And yeah, so it's not too bad, but hopefully you can see that it's actually not now sharpening any of this bit, but it is kind of sharpening the lettering a little bit. If we look in here, so turn the fade up some more, maybe play with the sort of balance point. Yeah, you can kind of really mess with this, but basically what it lets you do is sharpen the highlights or the shadows selectively, or you don't have to deal with that at all, and it is just quite a good sort of sharpening algorithm. So if we just kind of put that back to, in fact, top tip with any menu, by the way, if you hold down Alt while you're in a menu, the cancel button will turn to reset, and you can just reset the tool to its default. But we're going to turn the amount up a little bit, radius up a little bit, and hit OK. And it's just going to take a second to apply this one. So this one is kind of analyzing the image as a whole, whereas Unsharp Mask is like a slightly kind of blunter tool, if you like. But I prefer the way you can basically do like edge detection with Unsharp Mask, and this is kind of, it's trying to be a bit more clever. And it generally does a good job, to be fair. I don't know why, for whatever reason, my personal preference is Unsharp Mask though, so yeah, who knows why that is. Okay, so that's before, that's after. So that's again doing quite a good job. Ooh, smart sharpen. There we go. Now that we've looked at these, let's talk about my current favorite way of sharpening. And this actually doesn't involve using a sharpen filter at all. It involves using something that you wouldn't really expect to do. And the way we do this is, first of all, we need to duplicate our background. And this is actually not just so I can show you the effect, this is actually how you do the effect. You need a copy of your image. Now, if you're working in a layered image, you might want to do like a stamp layer, which you can get to by pressing Command, Alt, Shift, and E, and that will make a copy of whatever it can see. So it'll basically do like, it'll kind of merge all your layers and then make a layer of that, if that makes sense. If that hasn't made sense, if you try it yourself, you'll kind of see what I mean. So that's Command, Alt, Shift, E, or Control, Alt, Shift, E if you're on the PC. And now we have this. We're going to call this High Pass. And this is a kind of a not very frequently used filter, which you find in the Other section. And if you go to High Pass, you're going to get an image that looks like this. Now, basically, what you're going to look for is, as you bring this up, it's going to bring in more and more detail. And you probably only want this on a few pixels, so something like that. This is kind of your amount of sharpening, if you like, and you're just looking for how much detail you can see against the grey. So now we have that. What we now need to do is change the blend mode of this layer to overlay, and this is going to add it on top of our background. And as you can see, that's doing quite a nice job of just kind of sharpening everything up. Now, where this becomes quite cool is that because it's a layer in a blend mode, what you can actually do is, if you're not really happy with kind of how much sharpening it's doing, or if it's overdoing it, you can turn the opacity down. So there's that. The other thing you can do, and to be fair, you could, if you've done your sharpening this way by applying it to like a copy of your image and all your layers, you can do this to any of them. With the filters, what you can actually do is if you're using a smart object, you can use the mask attached to a smart object. But if you've done the high pass, you can actually just add a mask. And then I'm going to invert the mask by pressing Command I. And then with our paintbrush tool, I'm just going to make this brush a little bit bigger. And then anywhere that I paint with white is going to be sharpened. So we can actually come in here and we can selectively sharpen our image up. And there we go. So, that is one cool way of using masks to selectively sharpen parts of your image. So, if we only wanted to sharpen, let's just delete this layer mask. If we add another one and then invert, if we only wanted to sharpen up the words, we could just come in here and paint with white and just paint kind of over the wording that we really want to draw attention to. And then it's going to sharpen that, but it's not going to sharpen anything else in our image. And like I said, again, even with something like the Unsharp Mask, if we go to our Unsharp Mask layer, we can actually invert this, add a mask, invert the mask, paint with white, and you can selectively paint back in sharpening kind of where you want it to be. And that's one way of getting around the whole like localized sharpening thing. As I said, you could also do that with smart filters. So for instance, what we could do is we could duplicate our background. And then with this, we're going to go to Filter, Convert for Smart Filters, which is the same thing as if you were to right click and go to Convert to Smart Object. And we just give it a second here. There we go. So now I have this little icon in the corner, which means it's a smart object. If you apply a filter to a smart object, so let's apply a Unsharp Mask, and we'll just say OK, it's going to add sort of this little dialog, and this white box here is a mask. So we can actually come in here, and if we hit Command I, we can make that all black, and then if we paint with white, you can paint in the sharpening as you see fit. So that is that. The other cool thing about using smart filters, by the way, is that if at any point you decide, actually, you know what, I want that to be even sharper, you can just double click on Unsharp Mask. It'll bring back up a dialog and you can really go to town with it and kind of, whatever you want to do, really. The world is your oyster. Maybe that's a little bit much, but you've got quite a lot of options by using smart filters and the sharpening algorithms. So hopefully that has shown you some cool ways to sharpen. My favorite is definitely still using high pass and overlay, as it's a very flexible way of doing it, and I think it gives a very pleasing result compared to some of the others. But if you're only looking to sharpen your shadows or you're only looking to sharpen certain edges, there are options there for you. I've shown you the ones that are kind of red herring-ish and you should avoid. And I think that is going to do it this time, guys. Thank you very much for watching. My name is Toby, and we'll see you next time.